Hello, Mount Vernon fans, and happy June to everybody. Welcome to today's Mansion Monday, and I'm Tom Reinhart. I'm Mount Vernon's Director of Preservation, and today I'm really excited about this Facebook Live because of where we are. We are in the mansion cellar today, and most visitors who come to Mount Vernon don't get to come into the mansion cellar. We do have tours of it, but they're generally on top, over and above the price of admission, so not a lot of people necessarily get to do that. So I'm very excited to open the doors to the cellar to everybody today and to talk about some of the things that even if you took a cellar tour, you might not get, because this is new, up-to-date information over just the last couple of years that we have discovered, thanks to a very large and multidisciplinary study that we did at the cellar from 2017 until 2019. So it involved, of course, research in our historic documents. It involves studying the building fabric itself, and it involved archaeology. So the two major programs of preservation, and I'm really excited to be able to weave them together for you today. So the cellar was, in the Washington's day, a really important part of the mansion's life. It was the principal place for storage. So at the time of Washington's death, his inventory records that there were foodstuffs, there was alcohol down here. I think a barrel of apple brandy is one that jumps to mind. So this stuff was locked away in here. And when I say locked away, I mean locked away. As we see the cellar today, it is how it was finally configured in the 1770s, with a series of rooms that run off of this side, which go underneath the piazza. Because I'm facing south, you're looking north in the cellar. And then to the west side, there's a series of rooms that are under the major rooms of the mansion as well, with this long hallway or passageway that I'm standing in. The storage function is known because if we look into this vaulted room underneath the piazza, you see there's a doorway in the brickwork. But we found evidence in our study that these doorways would have been infilled with heavy wooden doors, and so would have all of the entryways into all of these storage rooms. So they were locked. And if we slowly turn around and make our way down this way toward the south, you'll see here that we have surviving doors. This one is the original from the 18th century that survives. This one is a 19th century replacement, but it's still pretty early. And these doors would have closed off the space that I'm in now to the space that you were in. You're in that passage with all the storage rooms. I am now in the cellar kitchen, which is the very south end of the mansion cellar, right below the study. So these doors would have been closed and locked. The doors into these storerooms would have been closed and locked. So there was a double barrier of security between people on the outside and people and the goods that are being stored inside. So if we come down into the mansion cellar, I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the cellar itself. Now, Sarah, if you could throw up that first image, we're going to be a little image rich today, because I think in order to really understand what we're seeing on this little screen in front of you, we're going to need to look at some images and some plans and some photographs. So the first thing that you have on your screen is a drawing that was done by George Washington himself in about 1774. And it shows his plan for the cellar. And it is basically exactly what I just described to you and what we see today. So if you look at it, you can see right in the center there, it says passage running sort of perpendicular to the bottom of the image. And then below it, there are a series of five rooms that are down at the bottom of the image. Those, only 3 were built. They're vaulted rooms that are underneath the piazza. On the upper half, above this passage, there are a series of 4 rooms which are under the main mansion rooms. But then all the way to your left, you can see written in that one big room at the end there, it says Cellar Kitchen. And that's what we're in now. So if we come and look a little bit at it, we come around here. Oh, and I do want to just warn everybody, because we're in the cellar, a lot of brick walls, and we're afraid that we might, if we move too fast, we might actually drop our connection. So if we do, we'll be back in just a second. We'll get back into the Wi-Fi range. All right. So as we come around here, you can see that there is a giant fireplace here, and I'm going to walk over to it and show you. So here is arch fireplace that is in the chimney stack, and this would have been the big cooking fireplace in the cellar kitchen. Now, yes, we do have a cellar outside, and you saw it last time with Caroline Spurry. I think that was last week. But many plantation houses had cellar kitchens as well as detached kitchens as well. But what's kind of crazy about this is that we have this big duct coming through it, and there's a bunch of concrete down here. And that's part of the more recent history of the cellar. As important as the cellar was in the 18th century, today, as we have received it through the centuries, it unfortunately has been a little beat up. And that is because of several reasons. First of all, in the 19th century, there was a lot of termite activity. So many of the beams that originally framed the cellar, most of the ones that we see here are 18th century, but these lower ones that are kind of stuck up underneath, these are late 19th, early 20th century beams. Many of the 18th century timbers got eaten out by termites, and so a lot of them had to be replaced. So there was not a high degree of integrity for the cellar. Now, I often say that we do have great integrity, such great survival in all the outbuildings and in the mansion. That's true, but for the mansion, it's true from like about here above, but not actually the framing itself in the cellar, especially on the north end. Everything got chewed up and replaced. But it also has become the home, because a lot of people don't come down here, it has become the home over the centuries of all of our infrastructure. So yes, our giant heating and air conditioning system that went in. And then also if we kind of turn and just kind of look above, we got fire detection, smoke detectors. We got all sorts of electrical conduit running everywhere. These are layers upon layers of infrastructure that have gone into this space to keep it out of the mansion rooms above. But to put it all in, the idea was to keep it all in the cellar where we didn't get a lot of visitors. Now we do get visitors in the cellar. So part of the reason why we undertook this plan to study the cellar, and I hope we're back live at this point, undertook the plan to study the cellar was to actually get it restored back to how it would have looked in Washington's time and hide a lot of these infrastructure intrusions that detract from us, our experience of it. Now, as I mentioned, if we could put up the archaeology plan, Sarah. We did a lot of archaeology here in 2017 and 18. And what you're seeing on your screen now is sort of a mosaic bird's eye view of the mansion cellar. And you can see that there's a lot of brick drains. There's a lot of areas that have been excavated. And that excavation, along with the study of the historic documents and the surviving 18th century building fabric, it really opened our eyes to the many, many changes that have happened in this house over the course of the 18th century. And we were able to learn about configuration of the cellar in the years before George Washington lived here, in the time of his brother Lawrence, in the time of his father Augustine. But we were surprised to learn that it wasn't just about the cellar that our eyes were opened about. It was about the first floor plan above. So if we go to the next, one of the things that we found in this, on your screen now should be a plan looking south along that passageway that we were looking at. And all of the pavers have been up and the archaeologists have excavated down to subsoil. And along the left-hand side, you see a row of bricks. That's a brick drain from the 18th century. But then to the left of it, you see a series of stones running along between that brick drain and the brick wall. Those stones are an earlier 18th century cellar wall that existed that got taken down by George Washington in the 1770s. Okay, so we can jump out a little bit now. But if we look down this passage, now we're looking the opposite direction that we were just looking at that photograph. And what we discovered archaeologically was that there were a series of drains, and here's one that we've opened up and have been covered up with foam and with plywood. But there is that open drain. It had bricks across the top, and that channel that runs down between the two lines of parallel bricks, that would have carried water out of this storage room to a large trunk drain, which is right here under my feet in the passage. And that trunk drain ran south through the cellar kitchen and out to the south lawn and then down a hill where it released its water downhill from the mansion. So we see in this system that Washington is trying to dry the cellar out in order to help to make it a secure and long-term storage facility. Now, what we learned about the evolution of the cellar and the evolution of the house is that the house plan changed over time. So if we go to that first floor plan, just to orient us, what you see on your screen now is the first floor plan of the mansion as it existed in 1799 and as it exists today. So the new room is to the left, the study is to the right, central passage right there in the middle. So in order to orient you now to what the house would have looked like, what part of today's house would have been occupied by the original house, we go to that 1734 plan, not the cellar plan, Sarah, but the one that's got the blue lines on it. Is that one up now? So there you can see that I sort of sketched in the very center of the house. That's the footprint of the 1734 house that was constructed for George Washington's father. So that's when we talk about the early house and the original house, that's it at the very core of the mansion today. If we move on, Sarah, to our next picture of the cellar, cellar 1. So there it is, the cellar as it looked in that first period under Augustine Washington. It's actually not a cellar. It's a crawl space. There was a brick foundation that held the house up, but it wasn't completely dug out. The house was actually built maybe 18 inches above the ground, and there was actually no excavated cellar below it. But if we go to the next image, what we discovered with our excavations in the cellar in 2017 and 18 is this blue area that you see marked out on top of the 1734 crawl space, is that was excavated out most likely during the residency of Lawrence Washington in the 1740s or early 1750s. And so that was a surprise to us, that we have had multiple generations of growth in the cellar as well. If we go to the next one, please, Sarah. But what was really interesting is that when Lawrence has the cellar dug out, they build all sorts of walls all throughout the cellar to divide it up. But they also serve the purpose of supporting the walls on the first floor. And what we learned about the first floor plan from the location of the cellar walls is on your screen now. And this is the 1734 house plan. We're back to that again. So you see that those blue lines are outlining what rooms were in existence in the early in the 1730s and 40s. And we have the front parlors there, the dining room is there, the downstairs bedchambers there, but the central passage, notice, is divided into two spaces. One held the staircase, and the other one was actually joined with the little parlor. So the little parlor and the east end of the staircase were one space. And this actually is a plan that we see sort of reflected in the Ferry Farm, the boyhood home that the Washingtons move into after Mount Vernon as well. So it was really surprising to see that the configuration of the central passage and the little parlor were so connected and so different than they are today. Then moving forward, when George Washington moves into the house, this is cellar plan 3, Sarah, we see that the cellar was actually dug out fully. So we went from that partial cellar under Lawrence to having almost the entire footprint of that early house dug out and subdivided into small storage rooms all over the cellar. If we go to the next plan, or the next image, please, Sarah. Then you can see that in the 1770s, we get the full-blown house as we have it today. And you can see that the south end on the left of that plan is the cellar kitchen. The north end is the new room. But notice there's a round circle in the new room. There's a well in the center of the cellar floor underneath the new room. And we're going to take a look at that in a little while. So that sort of gives you an idea. You can come back to me if you want, Sarah. That gives you an idea about how the cellar evolved over time, from a small crawl space to a partially dug out cellar to a fully dug out cellar for the early footprint of the house, and then to the full-blown mansion as we have it today. And so this sort of, consummates George Washington's plan for the storage area in the cellar. Now, there are a few things that I'd like to show you before we start taking questions. So we'll just talk for a few minutes. So the first thing I want to show you is that when we go back into the cellar kitchen, what we have are original surviving 18th century pavers here in the center section. You just see them poking out from under that protective plywood. But what we found, if you follow me, what we found over here in the back is that they were set in a mortar bed, which you can see this white mortar lying on the dirt floor. And then across the back here, there is a little channel that ran across here. And that was actually for the bottom of a wall. So there were rooms along this back area here. 1, 2, 3 rooms along the west end of this cellar kitchen. One of them in the center, and we're probably gonna come back and take a look at this sometime in the future. One of them held a staircase, and the evidence for that staircase is really intriguing and really very cool. And as I said, we're gonna come back and look at it at some point. But then there was a small room over here on the southwest corner, and then there was another room on the north end of this run of 3 rooms. And I'm emphasizing those rooms because we know from the documentary record that Frank, the butler, the enslaved butler, Frank Lee, and his wife Lucy and their children lived in a room in the kitchen, and that there were references to Frank's room in the cellar. And this was the first time, this study that we did really gave us the evidence for the first time that there were enslaved individuals living in the mansion. They weren't all over in the slave quarter. The Lees lived in the cellar in the same house as the Washingtons. And that was pretty surprising to us because no one had ever really kind of put this all together. But the archaeology, the architectural evidence, and the documentary evidence all came together to give us this really important information about the presence of another family outside the Washingtons that lived here. So the last thing I want to show you as we go along here is we're going to walk down this hall. You can imagine that maybe Frank got the key from Mrs. Washington. He opens these doors to go get something out of the storeroom. All of these doors on either, all these doorways on either side would have been locked up with big heavy wooden doors. And then finally, we get down all the way to the end here. And that's being very, you don't want to get anybody sick from shaking the camera too much. Not a lot of Blair Witching here today. And we come into this cellar room, which we affectionately call Mansion B06. But it's really the north room of the cellar, and it's underneath the new room, so right above our head. This big wooden box. Well, what this big wooden box does is keep people from accidentally falling into this. So, can you put the camera over there? About 20 feet deep. There's no water. It's a 5. Open and operational January 85. And we know the very precise date because there's a reference in January 85. Someone does because it's been protected in the cellar all these centuries. But we did dendrochronology on it. Didn't do a very good job of bringing far into the summer, but that's one of the really exciting secrets that the cellar holds. And and when you come down into the cellar, our interpreters talk about that. And so we had this ice well inside, and we also had the ice house down a little bit further down south on the slope. So at this point, I'm going to say I hope we didn't get dropped off at any point, and that you all could understand what I was saying. But I'd like to actually turn it over to questions at this stage. So do we have any questions at this point?
We do. We have a question from Erin Tom. She was wondering, how long is the mansion?
Erin, that's a good question. So the mansion is about 90 feet long. That original 1734 house is about 40 feet wide and about 30 feet deep. And then the 2 additions get built. The new room is about 25 feet wide, and so is the study. So you get 25, 25, and 40. That comes out to be about 90 feet, give or take a few inches. And then the entire depth is about 30 feet as well. Are there any other questions?
And a question from Cynthia. Did George Washington design the cellar and dictate what would be stored in which rooms?
The answer to that question is yes, absolutely. He designs it because we have his drawing that shows the layout of it before it's actually the full expansion of the mansion takes place. So we know what he has in his mind, just like, and actually you might have seen made reference to in our, in some of our west front work. We actually have a drawing of the west elevation of the mansion on the other side of that same piece of paper, which is pretty funny. But he designs the west front, the west elevation, and he designs the cellar before the expansion work in the 1770s. So somewhere around 73, 74 is when he's doing those drawings. But yes, you can be sure that he had a say in what was stored down here. But don't count out tomorrow's birthday girl, Martha Washington. Her birthday's tomorrow. She would have really been in charge of what was being stored where. As mistress of the house, she would have carried the keys, and she would have been the one granting access to these comestibles and making sure that things were not going off, that they were getting used in good time. And so that really would have fallen to her. But I'm sure the general had a say in that sort of stuff as well.
And a question from Gina. Can you repeat the information about the well? We might have dropped off and reference to events during the particular summer.
Okay, so what I talked about the well is that underneath the new room, there's a big dry well, meaning it doesn't go deep enough to hit groundwater. So it's just a brick-lined shaft into the ground. It's about 22 feet deep, and it was built in the fall and the winter of 1784, 85, based on the date of when the trees were cut for the collar on top of it, and then also references that Washington is starting to put ice into it in January of 1785. It did not work particularly well. I mean, it's hard to store ice in Virginia in the summer without refrigeration. So he had the ice house and he had this well, and neither one of them really did the work that he wanted them to. But ice would have been cut in the river and then would have been brought up here and stored. And it would have allowed the production of ice cream in the warmer months. It could have cooled down drinks as well. But it really was, despite all the effort of digging out a 22-foot deep well in the cellar and then having to hand carry off all that dirt, the enslaved workers worked really hard on it. It still just didn't meet the needs of providing ice well into the summer.
And Tom, the question is the passage open to the public?
The cellar passage is open to the public. Generally, in order to see it, I guess you need to be on our National Treasure Tour. And I think there's another tour, Matt, the Premier Tour or some kind of tour.
The Premium Tour.
Premium Tour also gets you access to the cellar as well. The general tour of the mansion does not come down here. It's a little too tight to have the number of people that we normally have coming through in a day coming through the cellar. But yeah, you can get access through those 2 tours.
And Tom, Michelle would like to know what was stored in the cellar.
So there were various implements and vessels. We know that there were pickle pots stored in the cellar. Presumably they held pickles, but maybe not. They might have just been empty pickle pots at that time. We know that there were casks of alcohol, as I mentioned, apple brandy. And if we come on down here again, you can, Matt's telling me to liven it up for everybody so we can see some things. If we come down here to one of the vaulted storage rooms, you can see, yes, we have interpreted it with casks. Now, these could be either for liquids or they could be for dry foods as well. But we do know that some of the distilled spirits that were made here in the distillery were kept here. Probably imported wines from like Madeira coming over from Europe would have been stored down here as well. But other valuables would have been, valuable foodstuffs would have been stored here, dry stored food, which really is why we see this great emphasis on draining this area in the 18th century and keeping it dry, because we are underground. So it's nice and cool down here, but it means that all that groundwater, every time it rains, is going to try and work its way into the cellar. And so that was a big concern for Washington, and has always been a big concern. I mean, there have been multiple maintenance projects over the course of the MVLA history here to dry as well. And in fact, one interesting thing is that when the archaeologists first cleared out one of the drains in these vaulted rooms in 2018, we got a heavy rainstorm, and the drain that they had excavated actually filled with water. So they're still actually working. Those 18th century drains are still working for us.
And a question from Stacy: does the temperature stay about the same year round?
It does. It's probably around 50 degrees or so. It is very pleasant here in the summer, of course, when it's 90 and hellishly humid outside. And then it feels warm in the winter when it's cold. So you do get just sort of this level temperature and humidity in here, which is good for storing some things and not good for storing other things. Things tend to get a little moldy down here if even though we have drains at work. And I think that was a problem that they faced in the 18th century as well.
And Tom, Bridget would like to know what was used to control rodents in the cellar.
Well, that's a really good question. And I do believe we have documentary references to the purchase of mouse and rat traps by the Washingtons. I'm pretty sure of that. And certainly that was pretty standard in the 18th century. There are some cellars that I've been in that are maybe a little bit better preserved than our 18th century cellar. And in addition to having those doorways, they actually have handmade screening, wire screening, in order to keep rodents from getting into spaces. So it was always a challenge, and I'm sure it was always a losing challenge. As in, when anybody start to get rodents in their house, it's hard to keep them out. But yes, they would have had access to mouse traps, and there were other ways that they could use by putting that screening up around spaces where they think that rodents are going to get in.
And a question, Tom, from Niels: how common were cellars in the 18th century homes?
They were pretty common. While doing the work for this, we did look at comparables in other places in Virginia, especially when we were trying to figure out what the situation was in the 1730s and 40s and 50s. And houses were often built with full cellars early on, and also partial cellars and no cellars. But by the time of the 1770s, I think cellars were pretty common for big houses like this. So to have a big full cellar with a kitchen, with storage areas, was pretty typical at that time.
And a question from Tom, who used to live in the Bell River subdivision, 2 miles from Mount Vernon. Are there tunnels underneath Mount Vernon, and has everybody done ground penetrating radar or anything to find those?
Well, you've seen National Treasure, Tom, so you know as well as I do that there are secret tunnels right in here. And actually, that's not true. There are no secret tunnels. But one of the things that I'm going to show you is this right here, which is pretty exciting for people who have seen National Treasure. This is the LW stone. So the original has been removed and was put in our museum. This is a cast of it in concrete that was put here in the 1930s. But you can see it's got these two halberds and a heart and LW. And it has a very 17th century feel to it. And it is not it's not a cornerstone. It's more of a cartouche. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, you get brick houses that have these carved stones that are placed above doorways, and they'll have the initials of the owner, or maybe the owner and his wife, and might have a little decoration, some heraldic decoration. And this really screams of that. Now, where it originally was from in the late 17th or early 18th centuries is anybody's guess. But LW, the W clearly seems to have an association with Washington, right? So it's probably Lawrence Washington. And there has been debate over time whether this is George's half-brother, Lawrence. It had something to do with his occupation of the house, although the wall that it's put in is definitely a 1770s wall. So it's George who's responsible for putting the stone where it is. what seems much more likely than Lawrence Washington, the half brother from the 1740s and 50s, is that it was from Lawrence Washington, the grandfather, Augustine's father. And he was one of the early patentees in this region, and he had this land, and he used it. Part of what you had to do when you got a patented land is to either plant it or seat it, meaning you had to plant some crops, or you had to build a house on it. And this might be part of a small house that was constructed here in the late 17th or early 18th century. That might have been in ruins, and this maybe was found as a relic by George, and decided to put it in the mansion cellar. But it is really one of the mysteries of the cellar and mysteries of the mansion is where this is from, what it was for, why it was put in this odd location here in the middle of a passage in the middle of the cellar where people couldn't see it unless you had keys to get into this passage. So we just don't have answers to that, but it's a pretty exciting artifact to have preserved, and it's really, when you come, go see it in the museum because it's pretty impressive.
And Tom, talk a little bit about whether you found any tunnels.
Oh yes, thank you for getting me back on track, Matt. As usual, I'm wandering about aimlessly. No, we did not find any tunnels leading from the cellar out to the hinterlands. I did mention that there was a drain that ran out. It was a pretty big drain, but it was a drain. There's no question that it was a drain. The only real tunnels that we have here dating to the 18th century is a tunnel that runs out of the bottom of the ice house out to the hill. That does survive to us, and it's pretty big. It's big enough for a person to crawl through it. And then there are some tunnels that were put in the early 20th century to help drain the hillside. If you remember, we had that big subsidence of the hill in the summer of 2017. And that's because those tunnels got clogged and had stopped working. In fact, they were forgotten and they were rediscovered with that. And those were cleaned out. And those are big tunnels, 7 feet tall, 3 feet wide, packed with gravel. So they're basically big French drains that run out. But other than that, no, we don't really have any tunnels, certainly not from the George Washington period.
And a question from Cindy. Is there any idea why George Washington would not have added his own cornerstone when expanding?
Well, for building a house like this, you didn't always, it wasn't very common to put a cornerstone in. For big public buildings, sure. When you're building a courthouse or an academic building, yeah, you could put in a cornerstone. But in the Chesapeake, I'm only aware of one house that has a cornerstone in the way that we think about it, and that's the Judge John Bryce house in Annapolis. It has a big cornerstone that has carved into it the beginning and then the date of the year of the construction of the house. And again, that's in the cellar. It's not outside. It's in the cellar, so you can see it from the inside of the house only. But then there are times where dates are put into buildings. Sometimes in the early 18th century, decorative bricks would be used to put a date and put initials into the sides of buildings. Sometimes, as I mentioned, you might get a stone cartouche that's carved and put high up in the wall, but they're really not that common, at least not in buildings that have survived to us, and especially not in a frame building like this. Brick buildings tended to have that occurrence a little more frequently.
And another question from Cindy. You mentioned a family lived down here. It wasn't quite damp, and what was the function of the family?
So the family was an enslaved family. Frank Lee, the butler, Lucy Lee, the cook, and their children. And so they, yes, it would have been, you're living in a cellar. It would have been damp. But it probably was, they probably also had use or probably had access to that kitchen and were able to have fires in that kitchen, which would have, sort of been their domain as well. It was, the very fact that a family had their own room or rooms, we don't know whether they had 2 rooms or 1 room, had their own room, an enslaved family, is unusual because the rest of the enslaved community are over on that north end, that north lane of the north of the mansion, and they're all in big, huge barrack rooms where they're sleeping in bunks, shared space. So this was really unusual and called the Lees out for their important role in the running of the mansion. Cook and butler are really the two, if you've seen, upstairs, downstairs, or Downton Abbey, right? It's that housekeeper and the cook and the butler are really the top tier of the servant class in England. And here, when you have enslaved servants, still those roles are very high up on sort of a hierarchy of labor on a plantation.
And a question from Kelly: do we know how long it took to build the cellar, and how many slaves perhaps were used to dig it?
We don't have information surviving about how many enslaved individuals would have been digging out the cellar here. You can imagine, as well as I can, that in the early excavation of the cellar, after that, the house is built with a crawl space, and then they're digging out below. That must have just been brutally backbreaking labor. We don't have a lot of information about the enslaved community here under Augustine or under Lawrence Washington, but surely it was those individuals that were carrying out that labor. We do have a little, I'm sure we can have a little bit better idea of how long it took to build the north addition under the new room and the south addition where this kitchen is, how long it took to get those dug. But with on a plantation where you have hundreds of enslaved individuals, they probably had a fairly large number of laborers working on digging those out and then revetting up, building the cellar walls up against the earth in order to hold back the soil from collapsing into the cellar. But I don't know off the top of my head how long that work took. It probably took I would guess a couple of months to get the whole thing dug out.
And all that work would have been done by shovels?
It would have been done by shovels, yes. And probably baskets, dirt into the baskets, and then baskets hauled out, dirt dumped into a cart, and then the cart hauled off somewhere. There's a lot of, as you might not know, but there are two knolls out on the east lawn that were actually very heavy clay. When we do archaeology out there, we see that Washington his workers threw a bunch of clay out there to create these two knolls out on the east lawn. We believe that clay came out of the cellar. So it would have been dug, put in carts, and then driven out there, and then used to help create the landscape and the vista that Washington wanted from the piazza. And we know that the bowling green gets leveled out to a depth of, there's about 5 feet of fill in some locations on the bowling green. That soil probably came out of cellar excavation as well, or at least leveling out of hills in some places, and then laying that out in the bowling green to flatten it out, level it all out.
And Tom, a question from Cindy. She always wanted to know why a single stone is highlighted in the basement without explanation. And is it lit up and sits by itself, recessed in the room?
I know what you're talking. I thought at first you were talking about the LW stone, but I think what you're talking about is this in here. So what that is here, Matt, if we can, I think you'll probably be able to come in. So we come into one of these vaulted rooms. We're underneath the piazza now, and this has been sitting here at least for as long as I've worked here in 2013. And what I believe it is, because we don't really have any information on it, it's clearly worked, but I think it's probably it was probably started as a top step for the piazza, so they're cutting it back, so they were going to make a nosing here, and then this would have been, it's actually kind of smoothed out on the other side of it here. So it would have been a paver, but a stepped paver with a nosing, like a stair tread. But for whatever reason, they gave up on it, and they didn't complete it. Maybe a big chunk of it broke off or something like that made it unsuitable to use, so they stopped working on it. So that's what I think it is. Why it's in this room, I have no idea. When it dates to, I have no idea. It could be 18th century, it could be 19th century, it could be early 20th century. Just don't know. Was it found archaeologically? I have no idea. There's just no information about this particular stone, but it is. I agree with you, Cindy. It's kind of, you're looking in this room and it's sort of like, there's this stone, but there's really no information about it. So it just sits here because that's where it's always been. Watch your head, Matt. Any other questions?
We do. We have a question from Cynthia. What interesting things have you found in the cellar?
Well, what was really interesting about our archaeological excavation is we found lots of features, meaning we found stuff that was built. So we found this entire drain system, draining all these rooms to the trunk drain that ran out. That was exciting. We found evidence of early walls that told us about the configuration of the cellar and told us about the configuration of the first floor. That was exciting. We found something kind of weird over here. If you come this way, I'm going to go slow so that Matt doesn't trip. So this is all part of what we excavated. And if you look in here, and I'll even shine my flashlight so maybe it works a little bit for you. There. So you can see there's like this giant brick pit. And if you come over on this side, there are steps going down to it. You see it? And then there's like an iron ring set down in the floor. You can get on there, Matt. Right? So you can see this. There's like this crazy thing, and we didn't know what it was. We had no idea what it was. And then we started going, doing a little bit more research about it. And what it is that there was a furnace installed here in 1870. And it sat on the floor, but it was so big that it was too close to the floor joists of the central passage, and it started to char those floor joists, and they started to get nervous about the fact that they might have a fire from this furnace. So they dug down the floor, they created this brick-lined pit, and they stuck the furnace down about 2 feet into the ground so that there was clearance between the top of the furnace and the floor joists, because that would have we wouldn't be here today if they hadn't done that. If there had been a fire, that would not have been a very good thing for George Washington's Mount Vernon.
So the question from Clay: how is the mansion wood protected from termites and other insects today?
So that's a great question, Clay. We'll be seeing you soon. This is how the mansion was initially protected from termites. So this is a copper shield that it was inserted underneath the wooden framing and the top of the foundation walls. This was done in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So termites can crawl up, but they can't get to the wood because of this little lip that hangs there. And so that has done a really good job from that period up until more recent times. That did a really good job of protecting the framing. And in fact, that was installed on all of the outbuildings. It's all over the place. It is not an 18th century feature. And although I am Mr. Gung-Ho about always restoring back to the 18th century, it's one feature I don't mess with, because you don't want to mess with success, especially when it comes to termites. But in order to be certain that we're not going to get termites, we do termite treatments around the perimeters of all the buildings. And so, knock on wood, we have not had any termite infestations in recent years. When they were doing work in the 1930s, they opened up walls and they had live infestations. They have photographs of the termites crawling all over inside the framing. It was really a bad scene. And thank heavens we don't have that problem today, because partly from the shield and partly from the pest control that we use around the buildings.
So Tom, probably just time for 3 more questions. This one from Dan Shippey. He said, are you saying that the Bowling Green was 5 foot lower before in 1785? Would that have made it equal to the field directly opposite the house?
The field directly opposite to the house. I don't know exactly what you're talking about in that, Dan Shippey, but what I'll say is that before the 1780s, when we get those 2 kind of lancet-shaped gardens, the upper garden and the lower garden, and we get that sort of figure-8-shaped bowling green with the 2 paths. Originally, the gardens that were constructed in the 1770s were big rectangles that went out and almost met into the bowling green. So the serpentine paths weren't there. You just had these big walled gardens that came out, and they were separated by a driveway that ran straight up the bowling green from out where the road wanders up from the west gate. So the road was probably lower. The elevation of the ground might have undulated, And I'm not saying that it's a even 5-foot lift to the surface of the Bowling Green. What I'm saying is that it undulated, it had a road in it, and where archaeology has been done, in some places, we can see up to 5 feet of fill to level it off when they moved those gardens back, reconfigured and built the new gardens, and then planted it as a green, a lawn, in the 1780s.
And a question for Kimberly, what's your favorite oh wow discovery item?
I think the drains were an oh wow for us. I mean, to know that we have a completely preserved 18th century drainage system in this cellar was definitely an oh wow moment. But the biggest oh wow moment was when we learned about the early configuration of the cellar and what it told us about the first floor. We had no idea that the little parlor and the east end of the passage were one room that ran across 2/3 of the length of the house. That was mind-blowing for us. And since then, we've confirmed it. When we did our fire suppression install, we were under the floor on the second floor, and you can actually see that the studs that make up that wall between the little parlor and the central passage are actually not tenoned in like all the other studs. They're stuck in and wedged and nailed. They were obviously added after. So that wall was built after the house was built. So that all started to click together and give us some really great information. So that and the drainage, those were really the two exciting discoveries of this project.
And a question from Derek. At the end of your presentation, could you guide us up the main floor, just orient us in terms of access to the cellar?
Sure. So in the 1770s, there were two access points to the cellar, one on the north end of the house, one on the south end of the house, right? So those were the main accesses. Now, we're going to come back at some point and talk about a staircase that existed here in the 18th century, a service stair that burned out in the 19th century, but we have found very ephemeral evidence for it, and it's going to be very exciting. Secret Spaces of Mount Vernon. Write your emails today. We're going to do it. Matt's smiling at me. We're going to do it, and we're going to go back, and I'm going to show you exactly what survives from that staircase and how we know it's there. But principally today, your accesses are outside. There are two bulkhead entrances. So we're going to go up here to the north end here and walk out the door. These big, wide bulkhead entrances would be here for bringing in barrels like this one, right? Laying in planks, rolling those barrels down for storage. So that's why you wanted to have exterior entrances to your cellar, because you don't want to have to be carrying barrels like this into your house and trying to lower them down a conventional staircase. You want to have a big, wide staircase like this one, and both of these doors will open like that, and you can see that you get a hogshead in here pretty easily. So we come outside into the bright, beautiful first June north side of the on the event. When we are outside, I want to thank you all for on a particularly hard year for Mount Vernon, as for all institutions of nonprofit institutions, museums, and the like. And the loss of revenues this spring has hit us really hard. So we've had to put off work that we were going to do this year for preservation of the buildings. We're going to have to be postponed at least until next year, if not later than that. Our big project for the cellar has been postponed.